Murder by Proxy. Written and performed by Tony Capobianco. He followed the hooded figure into the foggy forest. It was night. Light posts appeared as sentinels watching over the trail. Under ordinary conditions, these lights provided more than adequate illumination of the trail. This night, however, was different. The light caused the thick fog to glow, but it failed to provide visibility. Visibility was noticeably worse than it would have been walking on a lightless path without fog. At least under those conditions, the half-moon would have provided sufficient light. As things were, the water droplets within the fog had caused the light from both the moon and the lampposts to refract and create a murky veil. It was an ominous sight, almost an unearthly atmosphere. Carlos watched as the man in the hood deftly ran alongside the fog-shrouded trail. On several instances, the man suddenly stopped. Then he'd tilt his head back and swivel it side to side. Next, he'd spontaneously sprint further ahead. His movements seemed inhuman. The mannerisms were reminiscent of a dog tracking an animal in the wilderness. It was as though the man in the hood could see and move perfectly in the dark fog-covered woods. A barred owl called out into the night. "Hoo hoo choo-hoo!" It sounded as if the mysterious creature of the night was asking, "Who cooks for you?" Around 10 seconds later, another owl responded with the same vocalization. The pair of owls continued to call to each other as the distance between them grew shorter each time. An eerie howling wind along with barred owl calls were the only sound in the woods. The man in the hood remained silent as he swiftly sprinted toward some unseen target. The strangeness of the man's behavior hadn't gone unnoticed. Carlos and the owls keenly watched the mysterious man in the hoodie as he stalked the misty night. It was as though the owls themselves sensed something sinister, unnatural, and perhaps supernatural. Carlos was in a state of mind that was confused, concerned, and fearful. His reasoning was not right. His mind was as foggy as the evening landscape which surrounded him. He had always possessed a sharp mind. Critical thinking was a skill that his friends and family had always admired in him. Perceiving subtle details of people, places, and events was something that he always excelled at. On this night, things were different. His mind was jumbled. He felt as though he had been heavily intoxicated, but he hadn't had any drinks, nor had he taken any drugs. When he tried to think about any detail, the thought would fade away. It was as if his thoughts were like smoke that couldn't be grasped. The thoughts would repeatedly slip through his hands. A memory, or rather a partial memory, returned to Carlos. The image of him closing up Java Nirvana, the coffee cafe that he owned, came to his mind. He saw images of the cafe, him locking up the door, and rain falling down on his car. Next, he saw a pretty young woman as feelings of anger and fear swirled throughout his being. Then he saw an altercation with the young woman. The image of a pale-looking girl lunging at him briefly popped into his head. The memories and images vanished just as quickly as they had appeared out of thin air. When he tried to focus on any particular image, it would dissipate. The harder he tried to focus on a memory, the sooner it would vanish. Again and again he tried to remember, but again and again it was of no use. He grew increasingly frustrated. It faded away just like dreams fade away upon waking up from a sleep. He wondered whether or not the images and memories were from a dream, or even if he was currently dreaming. All of his memories were fractured and disjointed, just as is the case with dreams. Nothing made sense. A dreamlike fog had settled into his mind, and he questioned what was real and what was not real. Wrestling with this madness, Carlos continued to follow the hooded figure through the foggy forest. He couldn't recall why he had to follow the man in the hood, but he simply knew that he had to. Something in the core of his very being demanded that he track the man. The barred owls continued to hoot in the night. The man in the hoodie had run to a tree and stopped dead in his tracks. Crouching down behind an old oak tree, he could have been mistaken for a statue of a gargoyle. The thick blanket of fog made the crouching hooded figure look like a sentinel of a Gothic castle. Like a banshee, the disturbing man appeared to be a harbinger of death. A teenage boy appeared. He was walking his beloved mutt. He was only 20 yards away from the disturbing man in the hood. The boy was walking right towards him. The man was downwind from them. Had he been upwind of them, the trusty dog likely would have picked up his scent. Carlo shouted, "Boy, look out! Run back now!" The boy continued to walk further forward. Suddenly, the crouching figure lunged at the boy. With great violence, the man had knocked the boy to the forest floor. The dog growled and then attacked the attacker. Though the dog had drawn blood, the attacker swatted him away like a fly. The 60-pound dog had been tossed over 20 yards away. The boy's furry friend smacked into a tree. He was knocked out. The man in the hood pinned the teenage boy's arms to the leaf-littered floor with great ease. Though the boy was 16 years old and a varsity football player, he couldn't budge his attacker's grip. It was as though his attacker had the strength of 10 men. Carlos tried to pull the man in the hood off of the boy, but it was of no use. He couldn't get a grip on him. He pulled back his right leg and coiled it, before punting the man's head. Horrified, Carlos watched as his right foot passed harmlessly through the man's head. Carlos was stunned. He didn't understand how it was possible. He hadn't missed the mark. He was right on target, but the blow passed through the man. As the man pulled back his head, Carlos saw him clearly. Carlos's jaw dropped to the ground as he staggered backwards. What he saw was impossible. Yet he saw it, and he couldn't unsee it. The face he saw staring back at him was his own. The man in the hood was his mirror image. Bewildered, Carlos stared silently for what felt like an eternity. The man in the hood opened his mouth wide. 2 sharp fangs extended from the pale-faced man's upper jaw. Next, like a serpent, he struck the boy's throat with a vicious bite. Blood spurted out of the boy's neck as it gushed into the creature's mouth. Some of the blood splattered onto the leaf-covered ground. The man was a vampire. In a frenzy, he greedily gulped up the warm, life-giving blood of the handsome teenager. Carlos snapped out of it and yelled, "Stop it! Stop it! Get off of him, you monster!" There was no response. Carlos again tried to stop the beast. He cocked his right hand and launched a big roundhouse right to the vampire's jaw. Once again, his hand had passed harmlessly straight through the vampire. Not only hadn't he been able to strike the undead creature, but he hadn't even been able to feel any physical sensation at all. Confounded and desperate, he looked for a large stick or a rock to use as a weapon. He saw a large stick, but when he went to pick it up, his hand passed right through it. Raucous, monkey-like howling sounds filled the foggy forest. It was the sound of a pair of barred owls getting ready to mate. It seemed as though the vampire bloodlust had excited the nocturnal predatory owls. Helpless horror and pure despair flooded his soul. Carlos was watching himself as his own body attacked a teenage boy. His mouth had torn open the boy's jugular, and his lips sucked the life out of an innocent kid. He was watching a murder, and he was the murderer. He wondered if he was possessed, or if he was having some kind of psychotic break. He was in a nightmare, and it was a nightmare that he wouldn't wake up from. This was a living nightmare. Carlos couldn't make sense of any of this. How could he be a killer? How was it that he could watch himself as though he was watching a movie? If he was a killer, how in the world did he get to be so strong? How did he have fangs? Why was he drinking innocent human blood? Was he a vampire? Those were the insane questions that Carlos pondered until the boy was dead. Once the boy had been killed, Carlos feverishly looked on as a partly translucent shape rose out of the corpse. The shape looked like the boy, but it was ethereal. It was the ghost of the young man. The boy's spirit squinted his eyes and stumbled around confusedly. Then the boy looked at Carlos and said, "You! What did you do to me?" Carlos answered, "That wasn't me. I'm so sorry. I tried to help you." The spirit of the boy then faded away. Carlos observed that the ghost faded in and out for several minutes. Each time the boy appeared, he seemed confused. He didn't seem to know that he was dead. That's when it all suddenly came back to Carlos. He finally remembered it all. He had left work the previous night, just as he always had, when a strange woman approached him in the parking lot. The dark-haired, pale-skinned young woman smiled at him as she walked closer toward him. He had noted that while she was very attractive, she also had a wild look about her. She seemed to be both sexy and dangerous. Something inside of him sensed an unnatural presence. It was as though he was simultaneously drawn to and repulsed by her. The seductive woman was about 25 yards away from Carlos when he curled his lips, gave a half smile, and quickly opened the door of his car. Within an instant, she was upon him as she slammed the door of his car shut. He was startled. He realized that there was no way that a human could cover so many yards so fast. Even if such a speed were possible to achieve, why would she have sprinted toward him to slam his door closed and to pin him up against his car? Fear rushed through his body. He knew something was very wrong. The mysterious white-fleshed woman, less than an inch from his face, stared at him. She looked at him like she wanted to devour him. Right as he was about to say something, she lunged at his neck and bit him. He felt a terrible sting as her teeth pierced his flesh. Carlos struggled to escape her clutches, but he failed. She was stronger than anyone he had ever met. Even though she couldn't have weighed more than 110 pounds soaking wet, she had a machine-like grip. She possessed an inhuman strength. He was also discovering that she possessed an inhuman, insatiable hunger. She rapidly guzzled his hot blood as an athlete guzzles iced tea after a hard workout. The world began to spin as he grew ever more lightheaded. A fog fell across his mind as he found it nearly impossible to think. His legs felt like they weighed 500 pounds. Weaker and weaker, his body was unable to support itself. Only the vice-like grip of the vampire kept him upright against his silver car. As his consciousness faded further away, the incredible weight that he had felt throughout his body transitioned into an indescribable weightlessness. So much blood had been taken from him, and it caused him to feel as though he was floating in outer space. As his heartbeat slowed, his life flashed before his eyes. He had accepted that he was about to die. He accepted that he would never fall in love again, get married, have children, or expand his coffee shop into a successful franchise. He knew that he would never look into his old high school sweetheart's eyes again and tell her that he still loves her. When he was finally at death's door, the vampire slit her wrist and forced her blood into his mouth. Carlos wanted to resist, but he was so weak that he couldn't raise up more than a whimper in his defense. The vile vampire made him swallow her cursed blood. Her infernal blood tasted smoky and bitter. She had completely violated and dominated him. Several minutes after the accursed blood went down his throat, he began to convulse. In agonizing death throes, his body writhed on the dirty ground. Then he exhaled one final breath in the form of a terrible death rattle. He was dead. The infernal blood of the vampire had finished him off. Many believe that death always ends suffering once and for all. Those who think that way are mistaken. Sometimes a suffering so terrible that words can't adequately describe it ensues after death. Sometimes death isn't the end. Sometimes death is only the beginning of an unfathomable suffering and the birth of a soul-crushing pain. This horrible death is the kind of death to which Carlos had been delivered. After he had been mercilessly killed by a powerful preternatural creature, his soul departed from his body. No dazzling white light awaited him. No beautiful tunnel appeared. There was no comforting presence coming to soothe his aching soul. What waited for him instead was a nightmarish fog of confusion. As his spirit alternated between fading into and then out of the earthly plane, so too did his memories come and go. At first, he realized that he was dead, but that realization soon vanished. Dead and separated from his body, he watched as the female vampire went inside of his car and broke his windshield from the inside out. Next, she flung his car into a tree. She then picked up a sharp shard of glass and used it to slash his throat. This post-mortem mutilation hid the fang marks. Emergency responders might well come to think that a car accident had caused the loss of so much blood. The evil vampire proceeded to dump Carlos's corpse onto the edge of the lake that bordered Java Nirvana. Next, with great sorrow, Carlos watched as the emergency responders pulled his lifeless body from the edge of the lake and transported it to the morgue. He remained with his corpse, but he continued to fade into and out of our existence. Then, the night after his murder, he looked on in horror as a shadowy, inhuman spirit manifested itself in the morgue. The shadow being had the basic shape of a man's body, but had a grotesque dragon's head. It was the most frightening sight that he had ever seen. Though Carlos no longer had a body, he felt a bitter cold. The ghastly horror escalated. The inhuman spirit entered the deceased body. Carlos watched helplessly as his dead body rose up from the cold slab in the morgue. The skin looked like dirty snow. His reanimated corpse began to walk. The undead body found a locker, broke it open, and stole a gray hoodie and black jeans. Carlos was speechless as he saw his corpse dress itself in the stolen clothes. Carlos followed his walking corpse out of the morgue. Though his memory shattered as he had faded into and out of the earthly realm numerous times, he retained a singular focus. He knew that he had to follow his dead and hijacked body. Even when he had forgotten that he had been killed and that some kind of demon was possessing his body, he retained the compulsion to follow the man in the hoodie. When all of these memories came back to Carlos all at once, It was like a tsunami. Forgotten images and feelings made him drop to the ground as he held his head in his hands. Since he no longer had a physical body, he wondered if his reaction was a force of habit. Pain, guilt, remorse, fear, and a profound loneliness raged through his suffering soul. Watching his corpse kill a young man had brought all of his memories back. Carlos now understood that his body belonged to a vampire. The only body that he had ever had was now possessed by forces of darkness. There was nothing that he could do about it. He couldn't even punch the vampire. As far as he knew, he couldn't pick up any objects or influence the physical world at all. Nevertheless, he was determined to continue following his stolen corpse. He wasn't going to give up yet. More pain awaited him. Of that he was certain. The torment of watching yourself maul and extinguish the life of another is indescribable. It was all so surreal. This was the worst nightmare that he had ever had, and he was living it. Or perhaps, given the circumstances, it's more proper to say that he was dying it. Vampire Carlos was on the move again. The real Carlos felt an awful despair when he realized where the fiend was headed. They were only a few houses away from his former high school sweetheart. This monster was going to visit his first love. Although they weren't a couple anymore, they remained friends through the years. She didn't know it, but in the secret chamber of his heart, he never stopped loving her. A white-hot anger rose like a furious fire in his soul. The rage was amplified by the deepest sadness and despair that he had ever known. Sure, he had felt these emotions as Vampire Carlos killed the boy, but now it was magnified. The thought of his dear friend meeting the same horrendous, unnatural death was unbearable. With each step he took toward fate, the sorrow, rage, and despair grew in magnitude. When the real Carlos focused on his first love and her house, he suddenly found himself there. He had spontaneously transported his spirit into her house. Astonished that he had traveled at the speed of thought, the eyes of his spirit grew wide. There was no time to consider the awesomeness of what he had just done. He knew that the evil, undead imposter was only minutes or perhaps moments away. He had seen how quickly vampires could move when they so desired. "Lydia, it's me! I'm right here!" Carlos shouted. Though Lydia was standing only a foot away from him, she didn't hear him and she couldn't see him. Growing frustrated, Carlos shouted, "It's not him! He's not who he seems to be! Don't trust him!" Carlos repeated those words as a mantra. They became a desperate prayer. As he recited those words time and time again, an unexpected thing happened. The rage, sorrow, and despair had been swallowed up by a new feeling. It was love. Yes, a pure, deep, and sweet feeling of love had enveloped his soul. He could feel a great power in this love. A knock on the door caused him to feel like a deer caught in headlights. It was the murderous vampire. Lydia pulled out her phone to check the video from her security camera. She opened the app to see the footage as the voice at the door said, "Lydia, it's me, Carlos. Something terrible happened. I need to talk to you. Let me in." She put her phone down on the end table without looking at it. The footage showed something of crucial importance. The security footage revealed an empty porch. No one appeared in the video. Had the vampire not spoken to her through the front door when he did, she would have been alerted to the danger. Her silky black hair bounced as she walked toward the door. Lydia opened the door and said, "Carlos, come on in. What's wrong?" The vampire walked through the door. The ghost of Carlos felt love surge through his spirit again as he said, "Lydia, he is a vampire. That is not Carlos." Lydia squinted her beautiful eyes, glanced to her left, and smoothly slid her hand under a shelf near the door. The vampire had passed her and was now several feet into her house. He turned around and smiled. He flashed his fangs and then said, "Lydia Marsh, the fearless FBI vampire hunter, your time is up. The Master sends his regards." The vampire threw himself toward her. With his hands extended, he looked like a demon flying through the air. As his hands began to grab her, a sharp wooden stake pierced his ribcage and went into his heart. His body immediately exploded into thousands of tiny bits and pieces. The spirit of the real Carlos had succeeded in getting his message to Lydia. She had heard his thoughts in her mind. It sounded like the voice of Carlos, but it sounded even more authentic and clear. It was some kind of mental telepathy, and it probably saved her life. After she got the mental message, she slowly and stealthily put her hand around one of the various wooden stakes that she had hidden around the house. Special Agent Lydia Marsh was still suffering the nasty effects of the concussion that she had received by the hands of the Master. The Batcave incident had left her and Agent Castabello wounded, and neither had been cleared to return to duty. The Master was now hunting them instead of merely toying with them. She called Adam Gabriel and Annabelle and asked them to come over her house, but to be very careful. She told them that the game had changed, and that they were now the hunted. After Lydia hung up the phone, she began to cry. With the assault thwarted, her adrenaline dissipated. She finally had time to process what had just taken place. Her old high school sweetheart, her first love, had turned into a blood-sucking monster and tried to kill her. She then killed him, and his accursed undead corpse exploded all over her house. That's more than anyone should ever have to process. She cried as she realized what it meant. It meant that her first love and her good friend Carlos had been killed by a vampire. It also meant that he had been turned into a vampire. Lydia wasn't sure what happened to the souls of people who were turned. She didn't know if Carlos was at peace, or if he had lost his soul to the foul beast that had turned him. As terrible as those things were to consider, there was something that really weighed on her conscience. The message that the vampire relayed made clear that Carlos wasn't simply an unlucky victim in the wrong place at the wrong time. No, it was obvious that the Master had chosen Carlos. He knew that Carlos was close to Lydia, and that she trusted him and cared for him. Carlos was a pawn in the Master's diabolical game. She couldn't help but think that the horrific fate of Carlos was her fault. Had she not been a vampire hunter and a member of the Moon Mist Division, then Carlos would still be alive. As she sat and stared at the gruesome remains of her ex-boyfriend, she sobbed uncontrollably. She recalled the time that Carlos asked her out. Then she thought about their first kiss, the times they'd walked together at night, the laughs that they shared, and the real love that they had felt for one another. The spirit of Carlos watched her and sat beside her. She couldn't see it or feel it, but he placed his hand in hers. A knock on the door was followed by Annabelle saying, "Hey girl, we're here and we ain't no vamps." Lydia opened the door and let her teammates in. Adam and Annabelle gasped when they saw the gruesome scene. It wasn't that they hadn't seen the disgusting mess left behind by vampires that had been destroyed, but they were surprised to see it in Lydia's home. No team member had been attacked in this way before. Lydia filled them in on the nerve-wracking events. Annabelle gently placed her hand in Lydia's hand, held it, and said, "Lydia, sweetie, it's okay. Do you feel that? It's Carlos. He's holding your hand right now. He loves you, and he wants to console you. Lydia wiped tears from her eyes and replied, Yeah, that's a nice sentiment, but I'll never know where he is. No one can know. He's gone. Annabel smiled and squeezed Lydia's hand and responded, He isn't gone. I can assure you that he is right here because I'm looking at him. He is trying to hold your hand. He's been sitting right beside you since we got here. Lydia's eyes widened as she said, You really can see him? You can see ghosts? Yes, hon, I really can see Carlos. He's a handsome soul. I can see spirits sometimes. Usually I can only see them if they want to be seen. In this case, your sweet friend really wants to be seen and heard, answered Annabel. Lydia smiled and told everyone how special Carlos was. Annabel relayed the story that Carlos had told her. He described everything in great detail. Lydia again began to sob after she heard the terrible story. Annabel put her arms around her friend and said, Remember that none of this is your fault. Carlos now knows the kind of work that you really do for the FBI. He doesn't blame you at all. He is amazed at how strong you are and how much light you bring to the world. Lydia replied, Yeah, but I put a stake through his heart. I literally drove a stake through his rib cage. Annabel looked into Lydia's eyes and said, You put a stake through the undead heart of a monster. That wasn't Carlos anymore. An evil, inhuman spirit that never lived in a physical body possessed his corpse. That's how these kinds of vampires operate. Some willingly surrender their wills and souls to serve the master, and then he turns them. In other cases, these vampires force their accursed blood into the mouths of their dying victims. When no consent is given, the mortal dies. The soul is separated from its rightful body. Then, on the following night, a dark rider comes. The dark rider enters the accursed body, which has been resurrected by vampire blood. Lydia sniffled and questioned, The dark rider? So, Carlos wasn't inside of that thing? He wasn't a prisoner of the evil blood? Annabel continued to explain. No, dearie, Carlos wasn't inside of the vampire. However, his soul was bound to its former body, in a manner of speaking. When a dark rider takes over the vampire body, the original inhabitant of the bodily vessel is tethered to the stolen body. The soul walks in sorrow and distress unless or until the vampire is destroyed and the body is finally put to rest. The soul basically becomes a passenger that is destined to walk the earth and see the carnage caused by a dark rider who uses the person's very own body to unleash terror. Carlos didn't kill anyone, but he was helpless to stop the dark rider. All he could do was watch. The murder of the young teenager earlier tonight was a murder by proxy. Had you not driven a stake through the vampire's heart, Carlos would have been destined to experience a never-ending nightmare. You expelled the Dark Rider from its host. You have saved Carlos from unimaginable pain. After we give Carlos a proper burial, he'll be able to move on and find true peace. Lydia cried once more, but this time the tears were tears of joy. I hope that you enjoyed your stay here at the Haunted Half Moon Inn. The Master requests that you consider supporting me and the inn by becoming a slave. I mean a patron of mine on Patreon. The Half Moon Inn needs your support to keep the doors open. You wouldn't want the residents here to feel forgotten and abandoned, would you? Creating quality scary stories to share with you is very important to me. Running this inn of horror is a passion of mine, and I would truly appreciate your support. The world is hurting. It needs more horror. Help me to heal the world through horror. Together, with your help, we could haunt this world one home at a time. Until next time, always remember, just because you don't see them doesn't mean that they aren't there.